Summary of the previous unit. Cultural turn in second language education. The establishment of systematically teaching culture in second language classrooms through Realia-based approach. From the previous unit, we have learned how the idea of systematically teaching culture has been established in second language education. It is originally took the form of an object-oriented approach. It happened at the turn of 19th and 20th centuries in connection with the age of the direct method and reform movement in Europe and the USA. We call this period the cultural turn in second language education. It was a time when educators started questioning the nature of second language acquisition and therefore the principles of second language teaching. They argued that second language teaching must support the natural language acquisition mechanism. Since the natural language acquisition is based on oral interactions with others, the direct method prioritized oral proficiency and recommended teacher-learner oral dialogue as a central learning activity. This methodological orientation toward real-life oral communication led to reviewing the role of culture in second language classroom. Cultural component should not be reduced to reading and translating literature masterpieces, as was often the custom before. In contrast, second language educators realized the importance of the small c culture surrounding us in everyday life and accompanying real-life conversations. Therefore, the culture was introduced in the second language classroom and textbooks as realia, that is, different culture-related information and objects helping the teacher present and explain the target culture and teach everyday communication. The Realia aimed to create an immersion experience into the target culture without leaving the classroom and somehow substitute traveling abroad. Besides their role in teaching culture, Realia helped introduce new vocabulary and language patterns without resorting to the learner's mother tongue. Therefore, it supported the orientation toward oral communication promoted by the direct method. In the same period, we can observe a hierarchization of cultural topics in the form of the Brötchenkunde-Gretchenkunde model, the big C opposed to small c cultures. This hierarchy implies that historical and geographical facts, customs, and other aspects of the small c culture should be taught at low proficiency levels. In contrast, social relationships, literature, arts, and other aspects of the big C culture or achievement culture are suggested for more advanced classes. Their hierarchization contributed to the establishment of a moderate literature centrism. On the one hand, the literature was reviewed as only one part of multiple facets of culture. On the other hand, being placed at the top of the hierarchy, literature was considered in some way as a final goal of learning languages. The Realia-based teaching culture in second language classrooms belongs to the object-oriented approach. This approach views culture likely as a set of objects and facts. It does not require teachers' and learners' reflection on hidden cultural meanings, cross-cultural differences, and personal cultural values. Relevance of the Realia-based approach and its evolution into authentic materials-based teaching. Is the Realia-based approach outdated today? Not at all. The excellent proof that it is still important is how contemporary second language teachers generously decorate their classrooms with different culture-related object realia to create a positive emotional ambience and immersion experience for learners. Moreover, The tradition of Realia-based teaching has evolved into authentic material-based teaching. The claim for authentic materials arose in the 1980s within the communicative approach to second language instruction. Authentic materials, no matter how confusing and controversial this concept may be, refer to text and artifacts brought to the classroom directly from the target culture and real-life communication. These texts and artifacts are created by and for native speakers and are not specifically designed for teaching a language. The internet makes the usage of authentic materials and even whole authentic environments much more easier than before. Scholars agree that the usage of authentic materials has a lot of benefits, including those for teaching culture. It boosts students' confidence and motivation by experiencing real language. It helps to develop communicative competence, that is, the ability to act in various communicative situations. It makes students encounter words and constructions they would probably never see in textbooks and therefore help to develop pragmalinguistic competence, that is, the appropriate usage of language in different social cultural contexts. And finally, it exposes students to the culture, so help them to develop the ability to behave or think like target language groups in order to be recognized and validated by them. Among typical authentic materials, we find many items similar to those we can also find in the list of realia suggested by the theoreticians of the direct method. The significant difference between realia and authentic materials does not lie in the list of objects, but rather in the purpose of using them. Realia were suggested to introduce different information related to the target culture in general. The information we need to converse properly in different situations, so-called conversational realia, were only one of the realia's functions. The usage of authentic materials recommended within the communicative approach is valued mostly for their capacity to provide access to specific communicative situations and language functions. That is why in authentic materials we find verbal elements more often than in realia. Focus on values in understanding of culture in second language education and neighboring disciplines. Although the object-oriented and realia-based approach to teaching culture is still relevant in second language education, we also remember from the previous units that all recent models of cultural aspects emphasize, under different names, values. For example, the famous PPP model suggests three cultural dimensions: products, practices, and perspectives, values. This model is the basis of the standards for foreign language learning in the 21st century, adopted since 1996 by the ACTFL, American Council for Teachers of Foreign Languages. Patrick Moran, who completed the PPP model with two additional aspects, communities and persons, defines perspectives in the following way. Perspectives represent the perceptions, beliefs, values, and attitudes that underlie the product and that guide persons and communities in the practice of the culture. These perspectives can be explicit, but often they are implicit, outside conscious awareness. Perspectives provide meaning and constitute a unique outlook of orientation toward life, a world view. We can see that perspectives play the primary role in this model because they define the meaning of cultural objects and guide behaviors. Without perspective, products and practices do not have sense. To underlie the essential role of perspectives, Patrick Moran named his book perspectives in practice. In the same way, Yanfang Tang suggests reducing the PP model to two essential dimensions: manifestations, which include products and practices, and mind functions, embracing values and perspectives behind the manifestation. The mind function control and determine cultural manifestations and provide the key to correctly understanding their meanings. According to Tang, this simplified version of cultural dimensions model can help second language teachers to focus on the essential, which is helping learners to understand the values behind cultural manifestations, whatever these manifestations are: a piece of art, a piece of cloth, a novel, a custom, a language pattern expressing politeness, or a facial expression. Claire Krant, an American teacher of German and a renowned specialist in cross-cultural studies applied to second language education, argues that culture is no longer to be found in behaviors and events, but in the symbolic construction of reality through discourse. Some specialists in second language education, Patrick Moran included, use a visual metaphor of an iceberg to explain the relationship between values and other cultural aspects. Surface culture, explicit cultural manifestations such as food, flags, fashion, holidays, music, dances, art and craft, literature, languages, represent the tip of the iceberg. And deep culture, values, concepts, attitudes, approaches, beliefs, is all that lies beneath the surface. According to contemporary theoreticians of culture in second language classroom, we must focus on the deep culture iceberg, or on the relationship between the visible and invisible parts of the cultural iceberg. Second language education is not a unique discipline that understands culture as values. The shift towards values in second language education goes hand in hand with a similar trend in neighboring disciplines. For example, there is an interdisciplinary branch of studies that explores cross-cultural communication in the world of work and different organizations. This research field develops scientific tools to measure cross-cultural differences between people and explore cultural intelligence, the competencies anybody needs to act efficiently in multicultural workplace and other environments. Brooks Peterson, the author of the book Cultural Intelligence and Cross-Cultural Management, also put beliefs and values in the first place in his definition of culture. Culture is a relatively stable set of inner values and beliefs which have a noticeable impact on the people's outward behaviors and environment. Peterson also uses the metaphor of cultural iceberg to distinguish surface culture and deep culture. The deep culture includes opinions, viewpoints, attitudes, philosophies, values, and convictions, such as views about leaders, tolerance for change, assumptions about various relationships, attitudes to work, role of family, men and women roles, how the individual fits into society. The famous Dutch social psychologist Gerd Hofstede goes even further. He calls culture a software of the mind which is responsible for the mental programming. According to Hofstede, culture is something that programs our behaviors and practices through universal mental patterns such as symbols, heroes, rituals, and values. In this unit, we will try to find the answer to the following two questions. When and under the influence of which intellectual factors did the contemporary understanding of culture as values was aroused? As practitioners, we are also interested in how to teach values and meanings hidden behind manifestations in second language classrooms. In this connection, we will explore Robert's later contrastive analysis approach to teaching cultural values. The introduction of this approach in the late 1950s makes the emergence of the value term in second language education. Culture as values in contemporary anthropology. Ideational, value-based conceptions of culture. The disciplines which provide us second language educators with theories of the culture are cultural and social anthropology and cultural studies. Different theories considering culture as a system of values emerged in anthropology in the middle of the 20th century in connection with cognitive, semiotic, symbolic, and structural approaches. All these theories of culture have one essential point in common. They argue that people's behavior is governed by some invisible rules. These rules are stored in the human mind and determine, like a code, the way in which peoples see the world and produce and reproduce cultural products and social cultural behaviors. Australian anthropologist Roger Kissing called these value-oriented theories of culture ideational. Ideational refers to ideas or mental representations. Let's see how the culture is explained by some of influential anthropologists belonging to this trend. American anthropologist Ward Goodenough, the founder of cognitive and semiotic anthropology, suggested to consider culture as a cognitive system. Culture is not a material phenomenon. It does not consist of things, people, behavior, or emotions. It is rather an organization of these things. It is the form of things that people have in mind. They are models for perceiving, relating, and otherwise interpreting them. Culture consists of standards for deciding what is, standards for deciding what can be, standards for deciding how one feels about it, standards for deciding what to do about it, and standards for deciding to go about doing it. In his seminal work, The Interpretation of Cultures, another American anthropologist, Clifford Geertz, belonging to the symbolic anthropological school, advanced an understanding of culture as symbolic systems. According to Geertz, culture is embodied and transmitted through symbols. Culture is a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms by means of which men communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about and attitudes toward life. Culture is best seen not as complex of concrete behavior patterns, customs, usages, traditions, habit clusters, but as a set of control mechanisms, plans, recipes, rules, instructions, what computer engineers call programs for the governing. In a similar vein, French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, the founder of structural anthropology, viewed culture as a mental structural system. Any culture can be considered as a set of symbolic systems, in the first rank of which are placed the language, the matrimonial rules, the economic relations, the art, the science, the religion. All these systems aim at expressing certain aspects of the physical reality and of the social reality, and moreover, the relations that these two types of reality maintain between them and that the symbolic system themselves maintain with each other. Finally, the famous American social anthropologist Edward Hall, a pioneer in cross-cultural research, compares culture to a giant, extraordinary, complex, subtle computer. Its programs guide the actions and responses of human beings in every walk of life. We often forget that Edward Hall was the first who was introduced into contemporary discourse on culture the metaphors of cultural iceberg. In the literature and online resources, one can find many references to the cultural iceberg that do not mention Hall's name. Edward Hall used this metaphor to explain the value-based understanding of culture in his seminal book Beyond Culture, published in 1976. According to Hall, the primary role of culture is communication. The invisible part of the cultural iceberg programs communication between people. However, unlike the computer, the cultural mechanism allows not only transmitting messages, but also interpreting them and create new meanings. As professionals familiar with languages and their structure, we, second language teachers, cannot help but notice that the way in which contemporary anthropologists describe culture as a symbolic system of communication based on an association between mental representations and their physical manifestations is very similar to how contemporary linguists describe languages. Is this a mere coincidence? Not at all. The value-oriented anthropology openly looked for inspiration in linguistics and semiotics. Let's briefly review basic principles of linguistic methodology to understand better the intellectual roots of value-based conception of culture. Linguistic and semiotic view of language, intellectual roots of the value-based conception of culture. Contemporary linguistics is based on the assumption that language is an essential instrument of communication and meaning-making. Therefore, general linguistics explains the mechanism which allows languages fulfilling this function. The essential features of this mechanism were described by the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure in his famous course in general linguistics, published after his death in 1916. First, Saussure argues that language works as a system of signs or semiotic system. That means that language and all its elements, linguistic units, have a bilateral or double nature. On the one hand, language exists as speech, Rede, individual utterances we can produce, hear, or read in the follow of a verbal exchange. Ferdinand de Saussure called this facet language parole. On the other hand, what allows people to reproduce and recognize speech patterns in all contexts and despite individual differences is an abstract structure that is always behind parole. Whoever does not have this structure in the brain cannot understand and produce speech in a given language. Saussure calls this abstract structure langue. Langue is a set of mental representations, rules, a kind of code stored in the human brain. These mental representations are unconscious and get activated spontaneously. They are common for all members of a group speaking the same language. Children acquire this code through massive exposure to language and communication with adults. Interestingly, some historians of linguistics view Saussure's opposition between langue and parole, abstract representations, and their material manifestations, as an evolution of the concept of Volksgeist, the spirit of the nation, which we discussed previously in connection with the intellectual roots of the nation-related notion of culture. In 20th century anthropology parlance, Volksgeist is a set of mental representations shared by a group of individuals and having various manifestations such as language, customs, habits, mythology, literature, etc. The famous German philologist Hyman Steinthal, who was the follower of Wilhelm von Humboldt's idea on language, used the concept of Volksgeist to explain the social nature of languages. According to Steinthal, language is a product of individual activities, but at the same time, it has a mental part, that is, mental representations shared by all speakers. This mental, social part of languages belongs to Volksgeist. Saussure borrowed this idea about dual nature of languages from Steinthal and developed it further without sticking to the too vague and philosophical term Volksgeist. The second Saussure's contribution is that all linguistic units of all levels, phonetic, morphological, or lexical, are signs and have a bilateral structure too. A linguistic sign is an arbitrary conventional association between a physical manifestation, signifier, signifiant, and its abstract meaning, signified, signifié, referring to a selected part of reality. The third key contribution of Saussure is the idea that linguistic signs are organized as a system, and the organizing principle of this system is opposition. The language system can be described as a semantic network. That means that any linguistic sign, for example, a phoneme, a word, or a grammatical form, gains value by being contrasted with a related concept within the same system. That is the same reason why different languages may represent the same reality in different ways. Let's see some examples illustrating how the language system works. In the Spanish and Italian languages, there is a phoneme U, like in uno. In French, there is also a similar phoneme U, like in tu, du, jou. Its speech realization is almost the same, but its value differs. In the French phonological system, the phoneme U, tu, du, jou, is opposed to the phoneme U, tu, du, un. Since in Spanish and Italian there is no U, Spanish and Italian learners of French usually have difficulties with distinguishing between U and U, like in pas du tout, tu es doux, une joue. Most European languages have two grammatical numbers, singular and plural. However, some languages, such as Lithuanian, Slovene, Hebrew, and Classic Arabic, have three grammatical numbers, singular, plural, and dual. The dual refers to two entities. Both language types have plural forms, but their value is not the same. In languages with two numbers, the plural means more than one, whereas in languages with three numbers, the plural means more than two. One more example from grammar. In both German and Russian, there is a grammatical case called dative, but its value is not the same because it depends on the whole system of grammatical cases each language has. German dative covers the meaning of indirect object, whom, and localization, where. In contrast, localization is not the function of Russian dative, only the meaning of indirect object. Because another grammatical case, prepositional, is responsible for localization. The meanings of one German grammatical case are distributed between two different Russian grammatical cases which are posed within the Russian language system. The lexical system also can provide examples. In English, German, French, Spanish, and Russian, there are verbs to express their motion from one point to another. However, the values of these verbs are not the same in these languages. In French, English, and Spanish, the verbs go, aller, and ir can be used in a generic sense, with no reference to specific means of motion, on foot or by means of transportation. So we can say, I am going to Paris, I am going to university, je vais à Paris, je vais à l'université, me voy a Paris, me voy a la universidad. To say the same in German or Russian, we must use two different verbs. Ich gehe zur Uni, ja, idu w Universität, ich fahre nach Paris. Ja, jedu w Paris. That is because in German and Russian language systems, the verbs referring to emotion on foot are opposed to the verb referring to emotion by means of transportation. Gehen, fahren, itzi, jechać. One more example. The value of the French word rivière is not the same as its English, German, or Russian equivalents. River, sluice, and rika. Because in the French language system, the word rivière is opposed to fleuve. Rivière is a stream that flows into another stream, while fleuve flows into the sea or ocean. This meaning distinction is not relevant for German, English, and Russian, which have only one word for both kinds of streams. Similarly, there are two words in English, wood and forest. The first means a medium-sized group of trees in a restricted area. The second refers to a large group of trees, an unrestricted area. However, this opposition is irrelevant in German, which has only one word, Wald, for both categories. After Saussure, many other linguists worked to refine the various details of the language mechanism. Structural linguists, members of the Hobengarten linguist circle led by Louis Hjelmslev, had developed further Saussurean model of linguistic sign, while the members of the Prague linguistic circle led by Nikolai Trubetskoy have developed the conception of opposition. American distributional linguists Leonard Bloomfield and Zelig Harris have studied the rules of distributions of linguistic patterns in speech. Their research has had a huge influence on computational linguistics. The American linguist Noam Chomsky, the founder of transformative or generative linguistics, has focused on the transformation rules that govern the generation of speech. The generative linguistics studies how the mental representations they call inner structures come up to surface and become the speech. Contemporary cognitive linguistics focuses on mental categorization constructs of the reality in the human mind. The last but not least essential contribution of Saussure is that he suggested considering linguistics, which studies language as a science system, as a branch of semiotics. Semiotics is an interdisciplinary field of studies that develops general theory of science and explores different symbolic systems, la vie des signes au sein de la vie sociale, the life of science within the social life. In semiotic studies, culture is viewed as sign using behavior and a complex network of symbolic systems humans use to exchange information and make meaning. Russian specialist in cultural studies Yuri Lotman suggested calling this network semiosphere by analogy to the biosphere. Semiosphere is a universe of symbolic meanings that man creates and inhabits. This typical 20th century view of language as a science system has profoundly influenced developments throughout the whole range of human sciences, including anthropology and cultural studies. We could observe this in influence that the conception of culture advanced by leading contemporary anthropologists and specialists in cultural studies such as Goodenough, Gertz, Levi-Strauss, Hall, Hofstadter, Peterson, and Lotman. Finish on the exploration of the intellectual roots of the value-based understanding of culture, we come to the following conclusion. The value-based approach to culture dominating second language education and neighboring disciplines today has been forged in cultural anthropology and cultural studies since the 1950s, 1960s, under the strong influence of contemporary linguistics and semiotics. According to this approach, the culture is organized and works like a language, as a network of sign systems or symbolic systems. Behind visual cultural manifestations, there are invisible representations that define the meaning of the manifestations. To understand the meaning of one cultural phenomenon, an anthropologist must discover the hidden cultural grammar, like a linguist discovers the rule of a new unknown language by observing its visible manifestations in the speech of native speakers. Like language rules, cultural rules remain mostly unconscious. People acquire them by communicating with others as they grow up.